He bought the property because it felt quiet and solid, the kind of place that made him think life would slow down in a good way. The land sat just outside a growing neighborhood, close enough to town for convenience, but far enough to feel private. At the center of it all was a small lake, calm and still most days, bordered by reeds and low trees that reflected cleanly on the water. The listing described it as scenic and low maintenance, nothing more, and during the walkthrough no one made a big deal about it. The homeowner association came with the purchase, which he expected. There were rules about lawn height, fence colors, and noise levels, the usual things. Nothing in the paperwork stood out as strange, and the lake was mentioned only briefly, described as a shared environmental feature managed by the association. It didn't raise alarms because it didn't sound like something he would ever clash over. He moved in during early summer, when mornings were cool and the lake mist lifted slowly as the sun came up. On quiet days, he would walk down to the water with a cup of coffee and stand there, watching ripples move across the surface. Fishing had always been a simple hobby for him, not competitive or showy, just a way to relax. So when he saw fish breaking the surface one afternoon, the idea felt natural, almost obvious. He checked the documents again, looking for anything that said fishing was not allowed. There was nothing clear, just vague language about preserving the lake's condition and maintaining shared resources. No signs were posted near the water, no warnings, no list of restrictions. It felt like the kind of place where common sense applied. On his first attempt, he used basic gear and stayed close to his own side of the shoreline. He kept what he caught minimal and released most of it. To him, it felt respectful, quiet, and harmless. But what felt small to him did not feel small to everyone else. Within days, he noticed people watching from a distance. Sometimes it was a pause in conversation when he walked by, sometimes a long look from across the lake. No one spoke to him directly at first, which made the tension harder to read. He assumed it was curiosity or simple nosiness. What he didn't know was that the lake had a history. Long before he bought the property, it had been tied into a loose system of water flow used by the surrounding neighborhood. Over the years, that system had changed, been patched, rerouted, and partially forgotten. Some residents believed the lake was decorative only, while others quietly relied on it for irrigation without thinking much about it. The association records were incomplete, passed down from one board to the next without careful review. Newer members accepted old assumptions, and old members assumed nothing would ever change. The lake existed in this gray area, important but not clearly understood. That confusion sat beneath the surface, just like the pipes that ran out from the water. From the homeowner's point of view, it was simple. He owned property by the lake, followed the written rules, and used the water responsibly. He believed that if something truly mattered, it would be clearly stated. What he didn't realize was that unclear systems often cause the biggest problems. As summer continued, the lake became the silent center of the neighborhood. To him, it was peaceful and grounding. To others, it was something that needed control, order, and protection from change. Those two views existed side by side without ever being spoken aloud. That quiet misunderstanding set the stage for everything that followed. Not because anyone planned harm from the start, but because assumptions replaced communication, and a shared resource was treated as if it belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. The first complaint did not come as a letter or an official notice. It came as a comment made just loud enough to hear while he was packing up his fishing gear. Someone walking the path near the lake muttered that fishing was not allowed and never had been. The tone was not curious or friendly. It sounded certain. He paused and looked around, expecting the person to stop and explain. Instead, the person kept walking, leaving the words hanging in the air. At first, he brushed it off, assuming it was just one neighbor with a personal opinion. After all, nothing in the rules clearly banned what he was doing. Over the next few days, the feeling around the lake changed. People who once nodded politely now avoided eye contact. A few stood farther back than before, watching quietly. It was subtle, but it was enough to make the space feel different. He checked the HOA handbook again, slowly this time. The language was vague, full of general statements about protecting community resources. There was nothing specific about fishing, bait, or access restrictions. It felt written to cover many situations without clearly addressing any of them. Thinking it was best to be proactive, he reached out to the HOA board by email. He asked a simple question about whether fishing was permitted and under what conditions. The reply took longer than expected and came back carefully worded. It said the matter was under review and that residents should avoid activities that could disturb the lake. That response raised more questions than it answered. Avoid could mean optional, or it could mean forbidden. The lack of clarity made him uneasy, but he continued fishing quietly. He believed stopping without a clear reason would imply guilt or none existed. Soon after, informal warnings began to appear. A printed notice was taped near the walking path, not official, just typed and unsigned. It mentioned protecting wildlife and maintaining balance, without naming any specific behavior. The timing made the message feel personal, even if it never said his name. Neighbors started talking to each other more and to him less. Conversations stopped when he approached. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Some believed he was overfishing, others thought he planned to sell the fish. None of it was true. What troubled him most was that no one would speak directly. Instead of clear rules, there were looks and whispers. Instead of a meeting, there were assumptions. The issue was growing without ever being properly defined. He tried again to get clarity, this time asking for a board meeting or written guidance. The response suggested that fishing was discouraged for the good of the community. Still no rule, still no citation, just pressure wrapped in polite language. It felt like being told no without anyone wanting to say it out loud. From the board's perspective, the situation looked different. Some members believed the lake was fragile and that any fishing could cause harm. Others worried about setting a precedent that would open the door to more activities. Few of them fully understood the lake's history or how it connected to the neighborhood. Rather than checking records or consulting experts, discussions leaned on tradition. Someone remembered that fishing was never really allowed. Another said past boards had discouraged it. Those memories became treated as facts, even without documentation. The conflict slowly shifted from an activity to a challenge of authority. To the homeowner, it was about fair use and clear rules. To the HOA, it became about control and preventing what they saw as disruption. Neither side felt heard, and neither fully understood the stakes. By the end of that month, the lake no longer felt neutral. Every cast of the line felt like a statement, even though it was never meant to be one. Silence from the board felt louder than any official warning. And the absence of clear communication allowed frustration to harden on both sides. What could have been resolved with a simple rule or conversation began turning into something heavier. Not because the issue was large, but because no one wanted to admit uncertainty. And that uncertainty quietly pushed everyone toward choices they would later regret. The issue quietly moved away from the lake and into closed rooms where decisions were made without him present. Board members began talking among themselves more often, usually after regular meetings had officially ended. What started as complaints about fishing slowly turned into concerns about control, image, and setting an example. The lake was no longer just water to them. It became a symbol of authority. Some board members felt that letting one person fish could lead to others demanding access. They imagined boats, noise, litter, and arguments that had not actually happened. Instead of dealing with what was real, they focused on what might happen someday. Fear filled in the gaps where facts should have been. They spoke in careful language, calling it a preventative situation. No one wanted to sound harsh or unreasonable, so they avoided direct language and used phrases like community harmony and environmental balance. Those words made decisions feel responsible even when they were unclear. The homeowner was not invited into these discussions. No one reached out to hear his side or explain concerns face to face. It was easier to talk about him than to talk with him. Distance made assumptions feel safer than conversation. One board member suggested posting clearer rules. Another worried that changing the rules would look like admitting a mistake. Someone else said it would take too long and create paperwork. Slow solutions were quietly pushed aside in favor of faster ones. As the talks continued, frustration grew. Fishing had become a daily reminder that the board was not being obeyed. Even though no written rule was broken, the act felt like defiance. That feeling made emotions stronger than logic. They began looking for ways to stop the activity without confronting him directly. Ideas were framed as maintenance, safety, or routine care. Anything that avoided conflict was seen as a win. No one stopped to ask if avoiding conflict could create a bigger one. One suggestion stood out because it sounded simple: treating the lake something that had been done before for algae. If the water was treated, fishing would naturally stop. It felt indirect, quiet, and easy to justify. The idea gained support quickly. Past treatments were mentioned even though records were incomplete. People nodded along, trusting memory over documentation. It felt familiar enough to avoid deeper questions. No one brought up testing the water first. No one confirmed how much treatment was safe. No one checked whether the timing mattered. Those steps felt technical and slow, and speed had become the priority. The decision was framed as routine upkeep. Meeting notes used soft language and avoided specifics. By the end of the discussion, the choice felt settled without ever being clearly stated. Silence was mistaken for agreement. From the outside, nothing looked different. The lake remained calm, the water still, the path quiet. The homeowner continued his routine, unaware that plans were forming around him. He believed the worst outcome would be a written warning or a rule update. What he could not see was how easily responsibility was being spread thin. Each person involved felt only partly accountable. The group decision made individual doubt easier to ignore. When everyone shares blame, no one feels it fully. The board convinced itself it was acting in the community's best interest. They did not see themselves as punishing anyone. They saw it as protecting something fragile. Intentions felt clean, even if the process was not. That mindset made the next step feel justified before it ever happened. Once the idea of treatment took hold, questioning it felt like slowing progress. And slowing progress felt like weakness. So momentum replaced caution. By the time any paperwork was prepared, the outcome felt inevitable. What began as irritation over a fishing line in the water had become a quiet plan, built on assumptions, incomplete knowledge, and the comfort of group agreement. The lake sat in the middle of it all, unchanged on the surface, while decisions beneath it were already in motion. The decision was made quietly, framed as routine maintenance rather than a direct response to conflict. Board members told themselves this was something they had done before, something normal, something harmless. They used familiar language like water treatment and algae control, words that sounded responsible and boring enough to avoid scrutiny. Calling it maintenance made it feel less like a choice and more like an obligation. A contractor was contacted without much discussion. The instructions were simple and brief, focusing on clearing the lake and restoring balance. There was no detailed explanation of why the treatment was happening at that moment. The contractor did not ask many questions, assuming approvals had already been handled. No notices were sent to residents explaining the plan. There was no public discussion or posted schedule. The board believed announcing it would invite arguments and delay. Silence felt easier than transparency. From their point of view, the lake had become a problem that needed solving. Fishing had drawn attention to something they preferred to keep quiet and unchanged. Treating the water felt like resetting the situation. Once the lake was no longer usable, the conflict would fade on its own. The homeowner noticed activity near the water early one morning. A truck parked closer to the lake than usual, hoses laid out along the shore. At first, he assumed it was routine upkeep. The association had handled landscaping before without notice. He watched from a distance as workers moved efficiently. Liquid was added to the water in measured amounts, spreading slowly across the surface. There were no warning signs, no explanations offered. The scene felt ordinary, which made it harder to question in the moment. By the next day, changes became visible. The water looked different, slightly cloudy, lacking its usual clarity. Small fish floated near the edges, barely moving. The stillness felt wrong, like a place holding its breath. The homeowner returned later and saw more fish washed up along the shore. The smell was faint but unmistakable. This did not look like simple algae control. It felt sudden, aggressive, and careless. He searched for notices or emails explaining what had been done. There were none. When he reached out to the board, the response was delayed and vague. They described it as necessary treatment and assured him it was safe. What unsettled him was not just the damage he could see. It was the lack of information about what had been added to the water. No details about chemicals, quantities, or safety measures were shared. Trust was expected without evidence. As days passed, the impact became harder to ignore. Wildlife that usually gathered near the lake stayed away. Plants along the edge began to wilt. The lake no longer felt alive. Neighbors started asking questions among themselves. Some were concerned about pets and children near the water. Others noticed changes in irrigation flow and pressure. Small inconveniences began piling up. The board reassured residents that everything was under control. They repeated phrases about professional handling and standard procedure. Few residents pressed for details at first. Most assumed someone else had already checked. The homeowner did not share that confidence. He began documenting what he saw, taking photos and notes. The timeline felt too precise to be accidental. The treatment had happened right when pressure overfishing peaked. What troubled him most was the sense that this had been avoidable. A conversation could have cleared things up. A rule update could have set boundaries. Instead, a shared resource had been altered without care or consent. The lake had been treated as a tool rather than a system. Something to control instead of something to understand. That mindset ignored the complexity beneath the surface. And complexity does not forgive shortcuts. As the days went on, the effects continued spreading quietly. Not dramatic enough to cause panic, but steady enough to raise doubts. The decision that once felt clean and efficient now looked rushed and incomplete. What the board still did not fully grasp was that the lake was not isolated. It was connected, physically and practically, to the lives around it. And once that connection started showing strain, the consequences would no longer stay contained. The changes became impossible to ignore after a few more days passed. What started as a few dead fish near the shore turned into clusters scattered around the lake. The water smelled different now, not strong but unnatural. Anyone who walked close could tell something was wrong. The homeowner returned one morning and saw birds circling but not landing. They hovered briefly and then moved on, as if sensing danger. The quiet that once felt peaceful now felt empty. The lake no longer behaved like a living place. He took photos from multiple angles, careful to capture dates and times. He noted how quickly the watercolor had changed. He documented the fish sizes and locations along the shore. It felt strange to do this, but instinct told him it mattered. Neighbors slowly began to notice as well. People walking dogs avoided the path near the water. Some complained about the smell, others about insects gathering in new ways. The lake had become something people talked about instead of enjoyed. At first, the HOA tried to downplay the situation. They said temporary effects were normal after treatment. They reassured residents that the lake would stabilize soon. The words sounded calm but lacked specifics. The homeowner asked again what exactly had been added to the water. He asked whether testing had been done before or after. The response was delayed and indirect. He was told the information was being gathered. Meanwhile, small problems started showing up elsewhere. Sprinkler systems that relied on lake-fed irrigation began acting inconsistently. Some yards received too much water, others barely any. Residents blamed equipment without realizing the source was struggling. One neighbor mentioned cloudy water coming from an outdoor spigot. Another said their plants reacted poorly after watering. Individually, these issues felt minor. Together, they hinted at a shared cause. The homeowner connected the dots faster than most. He remembered older documents mentioning water flow beyond the lake. He searched public records and outdated HOA files. What he found raised serious concerns. The lake was not just decorative. It fed into a network used for irrigation and emergency backup. Over time, that role had faded from memory but not from reality. The pipes were still there, even if no one talked about them. This realization changed everything. The treatment had not stayed contained. What entered the lake moved outward slowly and quietly. The impact spread beyond fish and plants. He shared his findings with a few neighbors he trusted. Their reactions ranged from confusion to alarm. Most had never been told the lake affected their water at all. They assumed safeguards existed that no one could actually confirm. As concerns spread, pressure on the HOA increased. Residents asked for reports and testing results. Questions became harder to deflect. The calm tone of earlier responses began to crack. Local authorities were contacted by multiple residents independently, not out of panic, but out of uncertainty. Officials asked basic questions about permits and chemical use. Those questions exposed how little documentation existed. The HOA scrambled to gather records. Old approvals were incomplete or missing. Some actions had been based on habit rather than compliance. What once felt routine now looked careless. The homeowner felt a mix of frustration and validation. He had been treated like the problem for fishing. Now the real issue was becoming visible to everyone. The focus shifted away from him and onto the lake itself. Still, the damage was already done. Fish populations had been severely affected. The ecosystem would take time to recover. Trust within the community had taken a hit as well. Neighbors who once stayed quiet now spoke openly. Meetings became tense and emotional. People demanded accountability rather than reassurance. The lake had turned into a mirror reflecting deeper issues. What stood out most was how quickly things had escalated. A hobby had turned into an environmental concern. Avoidance had replaced communication, and small decisions had led to shared consequences. The homeowner continued documenting everything, not out of spite, but out of responsibility. He understood now that this was bigger than fishing. It was about how power was used when clarity was missing. As the situation unfolded, one truth became clear. The lake was not just water. It was a system that connected everyone involved. And once that system was disrupted, no one remained unaffected. As more information surfaced, a larger picture began to take shape. The lake was not an isolated feature the way many people believed. It was part of a network that had been built years earlier, when the neighborhood was first planned. Over time, that system faded into the background, remembered by few and documented poorly. Old residents vaguely recalled discussions about shared water access. Some remembered emergency planning meetings from years ago. Others remembered signing documents they never fully read. Those memories had grown blurry, but the infrastructure remained. The pipes leading out from the lake were still active. They fed irrigation systems, overflow channels, and backup lines. Nothing dramatic or obvious, just quiet utility. The kind that works best when no one has to think about it. The HOA had operated for years on assumptions. They assumed the lake was decorative. They assumed past decisions were correct. They assumed someone else had verified the details. That chain of assumptions broke once water quality questions arose. Local inspectors requested maps and treatment records. They asked about testing protocols and notification procedures. Each request exposed another gap. The board members grew visibly uncomfortable. They had believed they were handling a small internal matter. Now they were explaining decisions to people who dealt in facts. Opinions no longer carried weight. Residents learned about the lake's role in pieces, through conversations, notices, and informal updates. Each new detail added to the unease. Trust eroded as understanding grew. Some residents felt angry that they had never been informed. Others felt nervous about what had already passed through their systems. Most felt confused about how something so important had been overlooked. The realization was unsettling. The homeowner watched the reaction shift around him. People who once avoided eye contact now asked questions. They wanted to know what he had found and how he knew. His role changed without him asking for it. He shared records calmly, without exaggeration. He explained what he had uncovered and what he still did not know. He avoided blaming individuals. Facts spoke loudly enough on their own. What stood out was how fragile the system truly was. Not fragile because it was poorly built, but fragile because no one maintained understanding of it. Knowledge had eroded even as pipes and valves remained intact. The HOA attempted to regain control of the narrative. They issued statements emphasizing safety and cooperation. They promised reviews and future transparency. But timing mattered, and this came late. Residents asked why fishing had been treated as urgent, yet water oversight had been ignored for years. That question lingered without a satisfying answer. Silence followed where explanations should have been. Internal disagreements within the board became visible. Some members admitted they had not known the full scope. Others defended the decision as reasonable at the time. Unity cracked under scrutiny. The homeowner reflected on how easily this could have been avoided. A single consultation, a clear rule, a basic review. Any of those steps could have prevented escalation. Instead, speed had replaced care. What bothered him most was not the initial misunderstanding. It was how quickly authority had turned defensive, how quickly inconvenience had been treated as threat, and how quietly a shared resource had been altered. The lake itself remained subdued. Recovery would take time and monitoring. Experts explained that balance could return, but not instantly. Nature responded slowly to sudden changes. Residents adjusted their routines. Some avoided using certain systems until testing was complete. Others pushed for independent oversight. Caution replaced complacency. The incident became a lesson discussed beyond the neighborhood, about governance, communication, and hidden dependencies, about how systems fail not from malice but neglect, and how control without understanding leads to risk. For the homeowner, clarity brought mixed feelings. He felt validated but also uneasy. He had not wanted conflict or attention. He had only wanted to fish quietly. Now the lake symbolized something larger. It represented how shared spaces require shared responsibility, how decisions ripple outward even when intentions feel small, and how ignoring complexity never makes it disappear. As reviews continued and oversight increased, one truth settled across the community. The lake had always mattered more than anyone realized. And once that truth surfaced, it could not be buried again. Once outside authorities became involved, the situation shifted from neighborhood tension to something more serious. What had been handled quietly behind emails and short meetings was now being reviewed by people with no personal ties to the community. That change alone altered the tone of everything. Inspectors asked direct questions and expected clear answers. They wanted to know what chemicals were used, when they were applied, and who approved the decision. They asked for permits, test results, and notification records. Many of those documents were incomplete or missing. The HOA tried to explain that the treatment was routine, that similar actions had been taken in the past. But past habit did not count as approval. Routine did not excuse lack of oversight. As reviews continued, residents began receiving official notices. Some were warnings, others were requests for cooperation. The language was careful but firm. It made clear that this was no longer an internal issue. Water testing expanded beyond the lake. Samples were taken from irrigation lines and nearby outlets. Results were shared in summaries rather than raw data. Enough information was provided to confirm that the situation required correction. The board held emergency meetings that were suddenly well attended. People who had never shown interest before now filled the room. Questions came quickly and emotionally. Why were residents not informed earlier? Why was fishing treated as a threat, but water safety treated as an afterthought? Why were assumptions allowed to guide decisions? These questions did not have easy answers. Board members looked tired and defensive. Some admitted they relied on outdated knowledge. Others said they trusted past practices without verifying them. A few remained silent. The homeowner sat quietly during these meetings. He was no longer the focus. Attention had shifted toward accountability and process. The room felt heavier than before. Legal counsel became part of the conversation. Carefully chosen words replaced casual explanations. Statements were reviewed before being shared. Transparency became measured rather than open. Fines were discussed, not as punishment, but as consequence. Corrective steps were outlined. Future oversight requirements were explained. The cost of shortcuts became clear. Some residents worried about property values. Others worried about long-term trust. A few worried about health even if risks were low. Concern took many forms. Leadership within the HOA began to change. Resignations were discussed, and in some cases offered. New volunteers stepped forward cautiously. The idea of responsibility no longer felt abstract. The homeowner felt conflicted watching it unfold. He did not feel satisfaction. He did not feel vindictive. He felt tired. The situation had grown far beyond his original concern. Fishing had only exposed deeper cracks. The real issue was how decisions were made when no one was watching, and how quickly power could replace care. Officials emphasized that recovery was possible, that systems could be corrected and monitored, but trust would take longer to rebuild. That part could not be regulated. The lake became a subject of reports and schedules. Testing dates were posted. Results were summarized for residents. Silence was replaced with structure. Neighbors began speaking to each other more openly. Some apologized for assumptions made earlier. Others admitted they had stayed quiet when they should have asked questions. Shared responsibility became a common phrase. The homeowner continued to attend meetings, not as an advocate, but as a witness. He answered questions when asked, and stayed quiet when facts spoke for themselves. What stood out most was how quickly things changed once oversight arrived. Processes appeared where none had existed. Rules became specific rather than vague. Accountability stopped being optional. The incident became a reference point, mentioned whenever new decisions were discussed. A reminder of what happens when clarity is ignored, and when convenience overrides caution. By the time formal reviews concluded, the community looked different, not because the lake had fully recovered yet, but because awareness had. The conflict that once felt personal had revealed something universal. Shared systems demand shared understanding. Authority requires responsibility, and silence often hides the biggest risks. As the situation moved toward resolution, one thing was clear to everyone involved. This had never been just about fishing. It was about how easily small decisions can grow into lasting consequences. Time passed, and the urgency slowly gave way to routine. What once felt overwhelming became a series of steps, inspections, meetings, and follow-ups. The lake did not recover overnight, but signs of life returned little by little. Clearer water, new growth near the edges, and eventually small fish released as part of a restoration plan. The HOA looked different by then. Several board members stepped down quietly. New ones took their place with a more cautious approach. Rules were rewritten in plain language instead of vague phrases. What had once been handled through assumptions was now handled through documentation. Water testing became regular and visible. Notices were posted before any work was done. Transparency was no longer optional. Residents adjusted to the changes. Some were frustrated by stricter processes. Others welcomed the clarity. Most understood why it was necessary. The homeowner returned to the lake often, not to fish at first, but to observe. He watched as workers monitored levels and recorded data. He listened to conversations that were calmer than before. When fishing was finally addressed again, it was done through an official update. Clear rules, limits, and designated areas were defined. What had once caused conflict was now just another regulated activity. He followed those rules carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for what had happened. Fishing no longer felt like a quiet escape. It carried memory now. Neighbors who once avoided him now greeted him casually. Some apologized without making it a big moment. Others simply moved on. Time softened what tension could not. The lake became a reference point in meetings and conversations. People mentioned it when discussing new projects. Someone would always ask how it connects to everything else. That question alone marked change. The incident became a lesson shared quietly, not as gossip, but as caution, about how systems can be misunderstood and how small choices can affect many people. For the homeowner, the experience reshaped his view of community. He learned how easily silence can be mistaken for agreement, how authority can drift when unchecked, and how standing calmly on facts matters more than reacting emotionally. He did not regret speaking up, even though it had been uncomfortable. He understood now that avoiding conflict does not prevent harm. It often delays it. The lake itself settled into a new rhythm, not the same as before, but stable. Recovery left marks, but also balance. Nature adapted the way it always does. Visitors walking the path would not guess what had happened. The water looked peaceful again. Birds returned. Plants grew back along the edges. Only those who lived there knew the full story. And even among them, details faded with time. But the core lesson stayed. Shared resources require shared care. The HOA operated more slowly now. Decisions took longer, but fewer mistakes were made. Deliberation replaced impulse. The homeowner eventually sold the property years later, not because of the conflict, but because life moved on. Jobs changed, priorities shifted. Before leaving, he walked the lake one last time. It looked ordinary again, which felt like a success. Ordinary meant stable. The story did not end with a dramatic win or loss. There was no single moment of triumph, just gradual correction and learning, the way real situations often resolve. What remained was perspective, an understanding that control without knowledge is risky, that rules without clarity create resentment, and that communication matters more than convenience. Long after the headlines faded and meetings stopped filling rooms, the lake continued doing what it always had, connecting everything quietly beneath the surface. A reminder that some systems matter most when they are least noticed.